It appears that the WBC have well and truly screwed Dillian Whyte over. Just to take you briefly through the timeline of events, a few months ago, Dominic Breazeale fought Eric Molina, and it was billed as an eliminator for the WBC heavyweight title to face Deontay Wilder. But there was rumors circulating that it was actually a final eliminator. Now, Eddie Hearn, the promoter of Dillian Whyte, was obviously concerned about that because Eric Molina was lower in the rankings than Dillian Whyte. And he might have also, Breazeale might have been lower at the time as well, I'm not sure, but Eric Molina was certainly lower in the rankings than Dillian Whyte. So Eddie Hearn's thinking, well, how the hell can Molina be involved in a final eliminator when Dillian Whyte is above him in the rankings and he's ready to fight? That can't be right. So Eddie Hearn contacted the WBC, and the WBC, according to Hearn, responded in writing and said, it's not a final eliminator. Breazeale versus Molina categorically is not a final eliminator. Hearn also says that the WBC told the press publicly that Breazeale versus Molina is not a final eliminator. So because of that, Hearn and Whyte continued down the WBC route to try and become mandatory. They fought a couple times for the WBC silver title. They paid their sanctioning fees. So the WBC is getting money from Whyte and Hearn at this point, thinking that they can get Dillian Whyte into the mandatory position. But just recently, in the past couple days, Dillian Whyte was ordered to face Luis Ortiz in the final eliminator. And Eddie Hearn says, okay, that's fine, that's cool. Whyte will fight Luis Ortiz, no problem, in the final eliminator, and the winner takes on Wilder. But then he noticed in the letter from the WBC that it said it would be the second final eliminator. Eddie Hearn's thinking, what? What do you mean second final eliminator? What's the first final eliminator? He contacted the WBC and they said that Breazeale versus Molina was the first final eliminator and that Dominic Breazeale is the mandatory for Wilder. And Eddie Hearn said, oh, hang on, that's not true. Because you told me in writing that it wasn't a final eliminator. Why are you changing the goalposts now? Why are you moving the goalposts? You know, this looks like some shenanigans going on here. And indeed, it is shenanigans, people. If what Eddie Hearn is saying is true, then I'm going to call it corruption. Eddie Hearn don't want to go as far as calling it corruption because he has several fighters who are in the WBC rankings. So he wants to try and maintain good diplomatic relations with the WBC. But I'm going to call it out for what it is. It's corruption. Yeah. How on earth can they lie to the press and lie to Eddie Hearn and say that Breazeale versus Molina is not a final eliminator, and then a couple months down the line when Whyte has paid more sanctioning fees and fought more fights under the WBC jurisdiction, how the hell can they then put Dominic Breazeale, a guy who's ranked below him, as the mandatory challenger for Wilder? How the hell does that work? It's corruption. Plain and simple. There appears to be a very cozy relationship between Dominic Breazeale's handlers and the WBC. A very cozy relationship in order for them to have manifested this situation. Dillian Whyte is understandably vexed about it. Anybody would be. And, you know, some people are going to say, well, Whyte's going to get his shot anyway, so why don't he just be patient? Because he's fighting the final eliminator now. He'll become the mandatory after Breazeale. The reason that he should be vexed is because time is money. If Dominic Breazeale is the mandatory and Wilder fights him, you know, sometime in the next couple months, that means Wilder don't have to fight another mandatory for a long while if he beats Breazeale. You don't have to fight another mandatory for what? Maybe 9 months, 12 months, possibly more than that. Whereas if Dominic Breazeale is just a voluntary and not a mandatory, then he's going to probably have to fight Dillian Whyte this year, Deontay Wilder. You see? This is why it's an issue. It's kind of like the Alida Alvarez situation with Adonis Stevenson, where Alvarez was left out in the cold waiting for ages for his WBC mandatory shot. Ridiculous. In the end, he went a different route and he's facing Kovalev instead. Perhaps Dillian Whyte will have to do the same thing since he's been messed around by the WBC here. Clearly to me. Let me know how you feel about the situation in the comment section below, people. Dillian Whyte was going off on the WBC on Twitter. You understand? The fact that he was going off on them is not going to do him any favors. If there was a way to get him to be the mandatory rather than Dominic Brazil being mandatory, then he might have blown it by going off in the WBC the way that he did. I understand why he went off, but you got to be tactful in situations like this. Now, how are these situations normally dealt with? In the courtroom, usually, there have been many instances over the years where sanctioning bodies haven't stuck to their own rules and they've been taken to court by certain fighters and forced to stick to their own rules. A recent example would be Fraser Kendo, who took the WBA to court. I believe Lucas Brown also took the WBA to court. And in both instances, they won. I mean, actually, I'm not sure if Kendo went to court, but he certainly threatened legal action. And Lucas Brown, I think, was in the process of implementing legal action. So he may have taken them to court. But in both instances, the fighter came out on top and they got what they wanted from the WBA. So perhaps Eddie Hearn, who ostensibly doesn't involve himself in too much legal action, perhaps he could do that here with the WBC and say, hey, you're backtracking. We paid our sanctioning fees. Dillian Whyte has been above Dominic Brazil and Molina in your rankings, and yet you make those, Dominic Brazil mandatory and Dillian Whyte not. That can't be right. We're gonna press legal action upon you. We'll see what happens here, people. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. It's Tatman, I'm out.